before the world had heroes, before the gods held their thrones on Olympus, before the wars that would reshape the very heavens themselves. There was a silence, a vast, unmeasured silence that hung over all of creation, like a held breath. And into that silence stepped a being of such immeasurable power, such terrifying authority, that even the sky and the earth trembled at the sound of his name. His name was Cronus. Say it slowly and let it settle. Cronus, king of the Titans, lord of the Golden Age, ruler of the cosmos, before Zeus drew his first breath, before Mount Olympus had a single throne to offer, before the word God meant anything at all. To understand Cronus, you must first understand the world he was born into, because it was not a world that rewarded mercy. It was a world of raw, primordial power, where the first beings to exist were not gentle or wise, but colossal. They were forces of nature wearing flesh, and Cronus, among all of them, was the mightiest. He was the youngest son of Uranus, the sky itself, and Gaia, the earth beneath your feet. From the very beginning, he came from something vast. His father was not merely a god of the sky. His father was the sky, stretching in every direction, endless and absolute. His mother was not merely connected to the earth. She was the earth, breathing, ancient, and infinite. And from these two great parents, 12 titans were born. 12 beings of extraordinary power, but it was Cronus who would rise above them all. In many ancient traditions, he was called the Wily One, not simply for his cunning, though his cunning was legendary, but because there was something in Cronus that operated on a different frequency than brute strength alone. He was strategic, patient. He understood that power, true power, is not only won in a single moment of violence. It is held, maintained, and protected across time, and time of all things would become his most intimate companion and his most relentless enemy. His domain was immense. As king of the Titans, Cronus held sovereignty over the entire cosmos during what the ancient Greeks called the Golden Age, a time said to be so peaceful, so abundant, that men and women lived like gods themselves. There was no toil, no war, no hunger gnawing at the belly in the cold of night. The earth gave freely, seasons were gentle, and humanity, still new to the world, moved through its days in a kind of radiant ease. All of this flourished under Cronus. And yet, even in paradise, there is a shadow, and Cronus carried his clothes. He came to power not through patience or inheritance, but through an act of shocking violence. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story, a moment that would echo forward through every generation of gods to come. When his mother Gaia, suffering beneath the cruel and careless rule of Uranus, called upon her children to rise against their father, only Cronus answered, armed with an adamantine sickle, a weapon forged from the bones of the earth, curved and merciless. He waited. He struck. And with a single motion that split open the story of creation, Cronus castrated his own father and hurled him away from the earth forever. It was not a gentle beginning for a king. From that moment forward, Cronus ruled, and he ruled with an awareness that never fully left him. The awareness that what is won through the overthrow of a father can be lost through the overthrow of a son. Uranus himself, bleeding and humiliated at the edge of the world, had whispered a curse as he fell. "Your own children will destroy you as you destroyed me." A prophecy. And Cronus believed it. This is the paradox that makes Cronus one of the most haunting figures in all of ancient mythology. He was not simply a monster. He was a king who loved power the way all kings do, completely and at any cost. He was a ruler who had tasted the future and found it terrifying. And he was a father, yes, a father who looked at his own children and saw not his legacy but his end. And so he swallowed them, one by one. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, each one swallowed whole and held within him, not out of cruelty for cruelty's sake, but out of something more complicated and more human than that. Out of fear, out of a desperate and consuming need to hold on. That is the figure we are here to meet today. Not a simple villain, not a mindless destroyer, but a king of immeasurable stature, whose fall was as grand as his rise. A titan who held the cosmos in his hands and still could not hold on. This is the story of Cronus, and we are only just beginning. To truly know Cronus, you must first descend. Not metaphorically, but genuinely, in the mind's eye, descend into the very beginning of things, before the mountains had names, before the rivers knew their courses, before the first human hand ever reached toward the sky in wonder or in prayer. You must go back to a time when the universe itself was still deciding what it wanted to be. The ancient Greeks called this beginning chaos, and they did not mean chaos in the way we use the word today, disorder, noise, confusion. They meant something closer to a vast and yawning emptiness, a dark, formless expanse. Not nothing exactly, but not yet something. A potential, hovering at the edge of its own becoming. A held breath before the first word is spoken. From chaos, the first great beings arose, not born in the way you or I understand birth, not from a womb, not from a union, but simply emerging the way dawn emerges from darkness. These were the protogenoi, the firstborn, the primordial ones. Gaia came first, the deep-rested earth, solid and eternal and inexhaustibly patient. Then Tartarus, the sunless abyss that plunged beneath even the earth itself. Then Eros, not the playful winged boy of later myth, but the original force of attraction, the binding pull that draws things toward one another. And then Erebus, the darkness of the deep, and Nyx, the night herself, mother of shadows. These were not gods in the way we would come to understand gods. They were older than that, larger than that. They were the architecture of existence. The walls and floors and ceilings of the world before the world had a name. And then Gaia, in her ancient and incomprehensible way, brought forth Uranus, the sky, vast, domed, radiant, stretching himself across the entirety of the earth, like a lover who cannot bear to leave. Uranus gazed down upon Gaia and found her endlessly beautiful. Gaia looked up at Uranus and found him magnificent. And from their union came children, extraordinary, impossible, enormous children. First came the 12 Titans, 6 sons and 6 daughters, each one a force unto themselves. There was Oceanus, who would become the great river encircling the world. Hyperion, the lord of heavenly light. Iapetus, whose children would one day carry the weight of the world and steal fire from the gods. Themis, the embodiment of law and divine order. Mnemosyne, the keeper of memory, from whom all history would eventually flow. Tethys, Rhea, Coas, Phoebe, and Creus, each one powerful beyond modern reckoning, each one a sovereign force in their own right. And then, last among the 12, came Cronus, the youngest. Often, in the stories of gods and heroes, it is the youngest who carries the sharpest edge, the youngest who inherits what the others could not hold, the youngest who looks at the world a little differently, because they have spent their earliest moments watching how power works, watching where it gathers, watching where it weakens. Cronus watched, and in the watching he became something the others were not quite able to become, inevitable. But before Cronus could rise, there was Uranus to reckon with. And Uranus, for all his radiant splendor, was not a gentle father. Along with the 12 titans, Gaia had given birth to other children, stranger, wilder, more difficult to look upon. There were the 3 Cyclopes, Brontes, the Thunderer, Steropes, the Lightning Maker, and Arges, the Bright One, enormous, singular-eyed, and possessed of a craftsmanship so extraordinary that they would one day forge Zeus's thunderbolts. And there were the 3 Hecatonchires, creatures of such staggering, unsettling power that even among the primordials they stood apart. Each one had 50 heads and 100 hands. Cottus, Briareus, Gyges, beings of pure, overwhelming force, whose strength was so immense that Uranus himself could not tolerate the sight of them. And this is where the darkness enters the story of the Titans, where what might have been a golden family saga curdles into something more complicated, more tragic, more human. Uranus was afraid. He looked upon the Cyclopes and the Hecatonchires and felt something a primordial sky god was perhaps not supposed to feel: threatened, diminished, uncertain of his own supremacy in the face of beings whose power he could not fully measure. And so he did what fearful rulers throughout all of history have done, in myth and in memory alike. He used his power not to protect, but to suppress. He thrust them back, deep into the body of Gaia herself, into Tartarus, that sunless abyss beneath the earth, and sealed them there, his own children, imprisoned not for cruelty they had committed, but for the threat he imagined they represented, for the mere possibility that they might one day overshadow him. Gaia suffered this enormously, to feel her own children pressed back into her body, trapped, groaning, turning against her from within, was a pain that went beyond the physical, though it was certainly that too. It was a wound of injustice, and Gaia, ancient and patient and deep as the world itself, bore that wound quietly, for a time. But patience, even in primordial beings, has its limits. She began to speak to the Titans, quietly at first, carefully. She came to each of her children and told them what their father had done, what he continued to do. And she carried something with her as she spoke. A great sickle, curved and terrible, forged from grey flint, sharp as the edge of fate. She offered it to her children one by one. She asked them to act, to rise against the cruelty of their father and set the world to rights. One by one, the Titans looked away. Oceanus, who would one day flow peacefully around the rim of all creation, would not take the sickle. Hyperion, bright lord of light, declined. Iapetus, Caius, Creus, each of the older brothers, in turn, refused, whether from love of their father, or fear of him, or simply from the deep-seated reluctance that even the powerful feel when asked to transform the world beyond recognition. They stepped back from the moment. Only one stepped forward, Cronus, the youngest, the wily one. He took the sickle in his hand, felt the cold weight of it, and said yes. What moved him? Exactly. The ancient sources do not say with precision. Perhaps it was ambition, that bright, burning hunger that the youngest of great families so often carry, the hunger to matter, to be first in something, to claim a crown that all the others had passed over. Perhaps it was genuine, righteous anger on behalf of his mother, on behalf of his imprisoned brothers. Perhaps it was the prophecy he had not yet heard, the future curling toward him like smoke, pulling him forward without his knowledge. Perhaps it was all of these at once, knotted together the way all truly historic decisions are, messy, multiple, impossible to reduce to a single clean motive. But he took the sickle, and he waited. He hid at the edges of the earth, in the places where land meets sky, where the boundary between worlds grows thin. And when Uranus descended upon Gaia in the darkness, that great spanning sky, pressing down upon the earth in his endless and possessive embrace, Cronus struck. The blow was sudden. It was final. It separated father from mother, sky from earth, old age from new. And as Uranus reeled back, as he tore himself away from the world in agony and fury, the first drops of his divine blood fell upon the sea, and from that sea foam rose Aphrodite, the goddess of love, born from an act of violence, as so many beautiful things are. His blood that fell upon the earth gave rise to the Erinyes, the Furies, those implacable spirits of vengeance who would harry the guilty across generations. Even in his wounding, Uranus created, and even in his retreating he prophesied. He cursed Cronus as he withdrew into the upper heavens, his voice carrying the terrible certainty of one who has nothing left to lose. "As you have done to me," he told his youngest son, "so shall your children do to you." A prophecy spoken in the white-hot grief of a father overthrown. A prophecy that Cronus would spend the entirety of his reign trying to outrun. He never could. But for now, in this moment, the sickle had fallen. The old king was gone. The sky and the earth had been separated, and between them, the world as we know it could finally breathe. Cronus stood at the center of all creation, and the cosmos looked back at him and waited. A new age was beginning, and the new king had a sickle in his hand, a prophecy in his ear, and a long, golden, complicated reign stretched out before him. There is a reason the ancients called it golden. Not silver, not radiant, not bright or blessed or beautiful, though it was all of those things. They chose gold specifically, and the choice was deliberate, because gold is the one substance that does not corrode. It does not rust, does not tarnish, does not yield to the slow, patient erosion of time, the way that everything else eventually does. Gold holds. Gold endures. And the age that bore its name was meant to feel precisely like that. Like something that could last. Like something that was finally, blessedly, permanent. It was not permanent, but we will get there. For now, let us sit inside it. Let us breathe the air of the world at its most generous, and understand what Cronus built before we come to understand how completely it came apart. When Cronus took the throne of the cosmos, the world exhaled. The Titans rose to their rightful places. Oceanus resumed his great circular flow around the rim of the world, steady and ceaseless as a heartbeat. Hyperion drew the light of heaven across the sky each day, with a kind of effortless grace that made morning feel like a gift. Themis held law and order and divine proportion in her careful hands, and the world felt balanced in a way it had not under the erratic sovereignty of Uranus. The Titanesses took their domains, and the whole of creation settled into a rhythm, deep and slow and wonderfully reliable, the way the seasons would later be, the way the tides would later be, the way all the great cycles of the natural world carry within them the ghost of that first, original order. Cronus himself ruled from a place of genuine authority. The ancient texts describe him as a sovereign of real magnitude, not a tyrant in this early chapter, but a king in the truest sense. Present, commanding. The kind of ruler whose mere existence lends the world a sense of structure. Hesiod, writing in the 8th century before the Common Era, describes this period in terms that feel almost nostalgic, almost aching, as if even centuries removed from the Golden Age. The poets who wrote about it could feel its absence like a phantom limb. Humanity, in this age, was new. Freshly made, some say, by the Titans themselves, or perhaps simply arrived into a world so hospitable that arriving in it felt like a grace. And what a world to arrive in. The earth gave food without being asked. Grain grew without the plow. Orchards offered their fruit without tending. There was no disease to hollow the body from within. No grinding poverty to hollow the spirit. No war to hollow entire civilizations of their young men, and leave the survivors staring into the middle distance for the rest of their lives. None of that existed yet. Under Cronus, the earth was simply generous, the way a mother is generous with a child she loves unconditionally. Humans did not toil. They did not struggle against the seasons or bargain with the soil or watch the sky in fearful calculation, wondering whether the rains would come or whether the crops would fail or whether the winter would be long enough to kill. They moved through their days in something that the Greeks described as a continuous, gentle feast. They aged, yes. The Golden Age did not grant immortality, but they aged the way certain trees age, slowly and with a kind of quiet dignity, until one day they simply slept and did not wake, and death came for them as softly as an afternoon dream. When they died, they became guardians, benevolent spirits watching over the living world, invisible stewards of the earth. Even in death, the people of the Golden Age gave back. This is the world Cronus presided over. And it is important, genuinely important, to sit with that for a moment, because it is easy, knowing what comes later, to read Cronus only backward, to see him only as the devourer, only as the paranoid king, only as the cautionary tale. But a being who could produce this, who could hold the cosmos in a configuration this generous, this livable, this profoundly peaceful, was no simple villain. He was a sovereign of tremendous capability. Whatever darkness lived inside him, whatever fear coiled at the base of his divine spine, he was also the king under whom the world was, for a measureless stretch of time, genuinely good. That complexity is worth honoring, because it is the same complexity that makes his eventual unraveling so devastating to watch. He ruled alongside Rhea, his sister and his queen, one of the great titanesses, a being of deep and abiding power in her own right. Rhea was associated with the earth in its most maternal expression, not the vast architectural earth of her mother Gaia, but the fertile, nurturing earth, the earth of the harvest and the hearth and the warm ground beneath bare feet in summer. She was, in many ways, everything the Golden Age felt like: abundant, sustaining, quietly magnificent. Together, they were a sovereign pair of extraordinary resonance. The king who held the sky together, and the queen who kept the earth alive. And, for a time, a long, golden, immeasurable time, that was enough. That was everything. But the prophecy was always there. You do not hear it mentioned in the descriptions of the Golden Age. The ancient poets do not interrupt their accounts of that luminous period to remind you that its king was haunted. They let you have it whole, the way Cronus himself perhaps tried to have it whole. Unshadowed, complete, real. But it was there. It was always there, curled in the back of his mind like smoke that hasn't yet found a way out. Your children will destroy you, as you destroyed me. Uranus had spoken those words in the blind agony of his overthrow, and Cronus had heard them land in the place inside him where truth lands, not in the mind exactly, but somewhere deeper, somewhere that does not have a name but that every living being recognizes. The place that knows. And so when Rhea bore their first child, when Hestia came into the world, small and sacred and radiant with the particular light of a new divine being, Cronus did something that no description of the Golden Age ever quite prepares you for. He swallowed her, not in rage, not in a sudden eruption of violence or cruelty. That is perhaps the most difficult part of it to sit with. He swallowed her deliberately, carefully even, with the full, clear-eyed calculation of a king who has weighed his options and made his choice. He looked at his own child, this new life that he and Rhea had made together, and he saw in her not a daughter, not a continuation, not a legacy, but a threat, a variable, a future he could not control, and he removed her from the equation. Rhea's grief was immense, and it was silent. The ancient sources give her little speech in this moment, and somehow that silence says more than words could. She had borne a child, the most intimate and staggering act available to any being, and watched that child disappear. She would bear another, Demeter, and then another, Hera, radiant and proud even in those first hours, and then Hades, solemn and deep, and then Poseidon, restless as the sea he would one day govern. Each one carried a term, each one given life, each one swallowed by the father who feared what they might become. 5 children, 5 divine beings of immeasurable potential, held within the body of their father like secrets he refused to release. What did it feel like? Inside him? The myths do not speculate, and perhaps that is wise, because some questions are large enough to swallow the imagination whole. But the titans around him continued their reign. The golden age continued to glow. The earth continued to give freely, and humanity continued its gentle, grateful existence beneath a sky that showed no outward sign of the consuming terror at its center. That is the thing about certain kinds of fear. They do not announce themselves. They do not crack the sky, or still the rivers, or darken the sun. They operate quietly, in the private chambers of power, and the world outside goes on looking golden. It could not go on forever. Rhea knew it. As she carried her 6th child, heavy with Zeus, who would become the storm, the thunderbolt, the force that would crack the golden age open like an egg and spill its contents across the future, she made a decision. She went to her mother. She went to Gaia, ancient and patient and intimate with the mechanics of overthrow, and she asked for help. Gaia told her what to do, and the golden age, which had always been borrowed time, began its long, irreversible count toward ending. There is a particular kind of grief that has no adequate name in any language. It is the grief of a mother who loves completely, who gives everything, and watches that gift be taken, not stolen in the dark by some anonymous cruelty, but taken deliberately by someone who should have been a protector, someone who stood close enough to the flame of that love to feel its warmth, and chose, in full knowledge and full sight, to extinguish it anyway. Rhea knew this grief 5 times before she decided she would not know it a 6th. Let us stay with her for a moment, because the story of Cronus is so often told from the king's perspective. His power, his prophecy, his fear, his fall. That Rhea can seem like a figure at the margins, a supporting presence in someone else's drama. But she was not that. She was never that. She was a titaness of sovereign power, a being whose connection to the living, breathing, generative earth made her one of the most fundamentally important figures in the entire architecture of Greek mythology. And she was a mother who watched 5 children vanish into the dark interior of a king who called himself their father. The first time, with Hestia. Perhaps she had not fully believed it would happen. Perhaps some part of her, the part that still held the warmth of the golden age in its chest, had hoped the prophecy would remain merely a prophecy. That Cronus would look at this small, sacred, radiant child and feel something that overrode the calculation. That love, even in a Titan king carrying a curse, would prove stronger than fear. It did not. And so she learned. Not all at once, not with a clean and sudden clarity, but in the terrible, incremental way that people learn the hardest truths, through repetition, through each fresh iteration of the same wound, reopening in the same place. Demeter came, and was swallowed. Hera came, magnificent even as an infant, and was swallowed. Hades arrived with the gravity of deep places already settled into him, and was swallowed. Poseidon, who would one day make the seas tremble, disappeared into the same interior darkness as his siblings. 5 children, 5 divine lives, suspended inside their father, not dead. The gods did not die so easily, and even within Cronus they existed, breathing, waiting, growing in power in that impossible imprisoned darkness. But gone from the world, gone from Rhea, gone from the light and the air and the generous earth, that should have been their inheritance. Cronus, for his part, moved through these acts with the methodical composure of a king managing a threat. The ancient sources do not describe him as tortured by what he did, not in this chapter at least. He was not a figure of obvious anguish, pacing the halls of some divine palace with guilt written across his face. He was something more unsettling than that. He was resolved. He had made a decision about how the future would be managed, and he was managing it. Each child swallowed was, in his calculus, another variable eliminated, another possible instrument of his downfall removed from play. He thought he was winning. He was not. When Rhea felt the sixth child growing within her, felt the particular, unmistakable weight of a life that would become Zeus, she did something she had not done before. She stopped waiting. She stopped hoping that this time would be different, that this child might somehow escape the pattern, that the king might soften. She had learned through 5 repetitions of the same grief that hoping for a different outcome from the same circumstances is not hope at all. It is simply waiting to be hurt again. So she went to Gaia. There is something profound in that decision. Gaia was not only Rhea's mother, she was the earth herself, the oldest surviving feminine power in the cosmos, the being who had already orchestrated one overthrow of one impossible king, who understood better than anyone alive that the powerful are not protected by their power forever, that even the greatest reign contains within it the seed of its own ending. Rhea went to this ancient, patient, incomprehensibly wise presence and laid her grief before her like an offering. And Gaia received it. And Gaia spoke. She told Rhea to travel to the island of Crete, to the deep, lush, mountainous heart of that island, where a cave opened in the slopes of Mount Ida like a secret the earth had kept for exactly this purpose. She was to go there alone, in the final hours of her labor. She was to give birth in that cave, in the dark, with the stone walls around her, and the deep earth beneath her, and she was to leave the child there. And in the place of the child, in the careful wrapping of cloth that Cronus will expect to receive, she was to place a stone, a single stone, swaddled in cloth, offered to a king whose fear had made him careless, whose certainty that he had managed every variable had made him, in the end, stop looking closely at the variables themselves. Rhea did all of this. The journey to Crete, the cave on Mount Ida, the birth in that extraordinary darkness, with the smell of deep earth around her and the sound of her own breath, the only sound in the world, and then the leaving, which must have required something beyond courage, because courage implies a single moment of decision, and this was a sustained, aching, ongoing act of faith. Faith that this child, left in a cave, would survive, that the plan would hold, that the stone would fool a Titan king who had swallowed 5 gods without hesitation. She wrapped the stone. She returned to Cronus, and she handed it to him. What happened next is one of the most quietly extraordinary moments in all of ancient mythology, precisely because of how undramatic it is. Cronus did not examine the bundle carefully. He did not pause, or sense the wrongness of its weight, or feel the absence of the divine warmth that a newborn god would carry. He simply swallowed it, whole, and without ceremony, and went on being king. 5 gods in his belly, and now a stone. And somewhere on a mountainside in Crete, a 6th child breathing in the dark. The infant Zeus was not left entirely alone. Gaia had seen to that as well, with the thorough care of a being who has been arranging outcomes for longer than most things have existed. The Curates, young divine warriors, were set to guard the cave, and they had a specific and remarkable instruction. Whenever the infant cried, they were to clash their spears against their shields, filling the air around the cave with the sound of bronze on bronze, so that the noise of a god's child would be swallowed by the sound of metal, and Cronus, listening from his distant throne, would hear nothing that alarmed him. And so the infant grew, nourished, some say, by the milk of the divine goat, Amalthea, who gave so generously and so completely that even one of her broken horns overflowed with an inexhaustible abundance. The original cornucopia, the horn of plenty, born from the same act of hiding that birthed the future king of Olympus, tended by nymphs, protected by the Carets, wrapped in the deep anonymity of the earth itself, which has always been the safest place for dangerous futures to grow. And grow he did, in a way that only a being of Zeus's eventual magnitude could grow, not slowly, not incrementally, but with a kind of accelerated divine urgency, as if he understood, even in those earliest years, that there was no time to waste, that somewhere beyond the green slopes of Mount Ida, his brothers and sisters were waiting inside a darkness they had not chosen, and that the clock of the prophecy was ticking, and that he was the answer to a question the cosmos had been asking since before he was born, when the time came. And it came with the certainty of all things that have been building quietly for years. Zeus did not act alone. This is another detail the popular telling sometimes simplifies. He had help, and the help came first from an unexpected direction. Meti, a titaness of extraordinary wisdom, whose name meant counsel itself, whose understanding of the interior workings of things was so precise and so deep that she would later become Zeus's first consort and the mother of Athena. It was Meti who prepared the draft. A mixture, some sources call it an emetic, others describe it more obliquely. That was slipped into the drink of Cronus himself, given to the king without his knowledge, in a cup that looked like any other cup on any other ordinary day. Cronus drank it, as kings so often consume the thing that undoes them, without ceremony, without suspicion, in a moment of perfect, ordinary inattention. And then he felt it, something turning in him that had never turned before, something vast and ancient and irresistible, rising from the depths of his own body, beyond his control for perhaps the first time in his long and sovereign existence. He had swallowed 5 gods and a stone. Now all 6 were coming back. First came the stone. It rose from him and fell to the earth at Delphi, where it would be kept for centuries, anointed with oil, wrapped with wool, treated as one of the most sacred objects in the ancient world. The omphalos, the navel stone, the center of the earth, people called it, because it was the first solid thing the king of the Titans ever released. And then the gods came: Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, Hestia, one by one, fully formed, blazing with a divine power that had been compressed and pressurized and contained for longer than most ages of the world. They came back into the light like something that cannot be stopped, because they were, in fact, exactly that. They were the future, and the future, no matter how many stones are swallowed in its name, has a way of arriving anyway. Cronus stood in the wreckage of his certainty. 6 children returned to the world. The prophecy, no longer a whisper but a presence. And Zeus, the son he had never held, the child he had never swallowed, the variable he had never accounted for, standing before him with a storm already gathering in his eyes. The golden age was over. The war was about to begin. There are wars, and then there are wars. There are the conflicts that reshape borders, that redraw maps, that topple dynasties and install new ones in their place, while the fundamental architecture of the world remains more or less intact. These are the wars of history, enormous, devastating, consequential beyond measure in the lives of those who lived through them, but contained ultimately within the frame of a world that persists. And then there is the Titanomachy, the war that did not merely redraw a map, but unmade and remade the entire cosmos. The conflict that did not merely change who sat on a throne, but determined what kind of universe would exist, what laws would govern it, what powers would shape it, what the sky would look like, and who would hold the lightning, and whether the world you and I were eventually born into would be the world it is. That war, the one that lasted 10 years and shook the foundations of creation so violently that the earth groaned and the seas boiled, and even the great starless abyss of Tartarus trembled in its bottomless dark. That is what we are here to talk about now. Let us begin with the shape of it, because before the first blow was struck, before the first divine weapon was raised and the first immortal cry of battle split the ancient sky, there was a geography to this conflict that is worth understanding, a clarity of sides that the chaos of the war itself would never quite obscure. On one side, Mount Othrys, ancient, vast, predating Olympus the way all old things predate the new things that eventually replace them. This was the stronghold of the Titans. Cronus held it as his seat of power, and from its heights he commanded the assembled force of an older age. His brothers stood with him, Iapetus, who carried the weight of mortality in his lineage, Hyperion, lord of the heavenly light, Coeus and Creus, each one a sovereign power in their own right. The full array of the original Titan lords, beings who had ruled the cosmos since before Zeus had drawn a single breath. Their power was immense. Their experience of war, of holding dominion, of defending it, was absolute. They had every reason to believe that what they had built could not be taken. On the other side, a mountain that would become the most famous peak in all of Western mythology, Olympus, still new in this moment, still being claimed, still in the process of becoming what it would be forever afterward, and arrayed upon it a small and extraordinary company of young gods who had no experience of ruling, little experience of war, and one incandescent advantage over everything the Titans possessed. They had nothing to lose. Zeus had grown to his full divine power on the slopes of Crete, nourished by a goat and hidden by the clash of bronze, and he arrived at this war not as a cautious strategist protecting an existing kingdom, but as something far more dangerous, a being with everything to win and a fury that had been building since before he was old enough to understand what fury was. He came with his siblings, Poseidon, whose dominion over water and earth-shaking force made him a weapon of catastrophic potential. Hades, solemn and devastating, and possessed of a darkness that made even other gods uncertain in his presence. Hera, Demeter, Hestia, each one adding their divine weight to the younger side of the scales. But Zeus understood something that pure fury alone could not provide. He understood that power is not only what you carry, it is also what you release. He went to Tartarus, down into that lightless abyss beneath even the deepest roots of the earth. That place so far below the world that an anvil dropped from heaven would fall for 9 days before reaching it, and then fall 9 more days before reaching Tartarus itself, down into the prison where Uranus had sealed away the most powerful beings ever created. The Cyclopes, the Hecaton chairs, the monsters and the giants that the old king had buried out of fear, out of that same essential terror of being overshadowed that had defined his reign and poisoned his legacy. Zeus broke their chains. He faced them in that impossible darkness, these beings of singular, 100-handed, 50-headed, storm-forging power, and he offered them what no one had offered them in the entirety of their imprisoned existence: freedom, recognition, a place in the war that was about to determine the future of everything. The Cyclopes, liberated, did what they did best. They made things, extraordinary, decisive, universe-altering things. For Zeus, they forged the thunderbolt, that signature weapon, that crackling, incandescent instrument of divine authority that would become the most recognizable symbol in all of ancient mythology. For Poseidon, they made the trident, 3-pronged and oceanic and capable of splitting the earth itself along its fault lines. For Hades, they crafted a helmet, the helm of darkness, which rendered its wearer invisible, which gave the Lord of the Dead the ability to move through the world unseen, a gift perfectly matched to its recipient. 3 weapons, 3 brothers, 1 war. The hecaton shares were no less significant. Each one, with their 100 hands, could hurl 300 boulders simultaneously, a capacity for projectile destruction so vast it beggars the imagination. When they entered the battle on the side of the Olympians, the Titans faced something they had no tactical answer for. There is no formation, no strategy, no counter-maneuver available to beings who are suddenly facing 300 boulders from a single opponent, multiplied across 3 such opponents in the same extended moment. The war began, and the cosmos suffered for it. 10 years, a decade of divine conflict waged at a scale and intensity that the ancient poets struggled to describe without reaching for every large thing they knew. Hesiod writes of it with a kind of breathless, staggered awe. The earth burning, the vast forests catching fire, the oceans seething with heat, Tartarus itself lit from above by the convergence of impossible forces. The ground shook continuously, not the localized trembling of an earthquake, but a sustained, total vibration, as if the planet itself had been struck like a bell and could not stop ringing. The sky, that vast dome that Uranus had once embodied, that Cronus had seized, that Zeus was now fighting to claim, became the theater of exchanges so violent that the stars themselves seemed to shudder. Divine combatants of unimaginable power colliding, separating, colliding again across a battlefield that had no fixed geography, because the war kept remaking the landscape faster than any fixed position could be held. Cronus fought in this. Let us not lose sight of him. This documentary is his story, and even now, even losing, he was formidable. He was the king who had castrated the sky with a single blow of an adamantine sickle. He was the sovereign who had held the cosmos intact for an age that poets would mourn for centuries. He did not yield easily or quickly, or without costing his enemies everything they had. The Titans under his command were not a rabble. They were original forces of creation, beings of genuine and terrifying magnitude, and for 10 years they held. But they were holding. And Zeus was not holding. Zeus was advancing. The difference between a force that defends and a force that attacks is, in any conflict, eventually decisive. The Titans fought to preserve what was. The Olympians fought to create what would be. And history, divine, mortal, or otherwise, almost always belongs to the ones who are building towards something, rather than protecting something already built. The hecaton shears turned the tide. Their entry into the war, with their 300 hands, and their inexhaustible capacity for devastation, broke something in the Titan line that had not broken in a decade of fighting. The boulders came in quantities that could not be counted, in waves that did not stop, and the Titan formation, that ancient, experienced, sovereign line of defense, began to fracture. And then Zeus unleashed the thunderbolts. The ancient sources describe this with a reverence that crosses the line into something almost physical on the page. The thunderbolts of Zeus were not simply weapons. They were the concentrated authority of the new divine order, made manifest in light and heat and sound. When he threw them, the earth burned. When they struck, mountains shattered. The sea itself recoiled, and across 10 years of war, he threw them continuously, tirelessly, with the absolute commitment of a being who understood that this was not merely a battle, but the decisive argument of the cosmos. The moment that would answer, once and for all, which age the world belonged to. The Titans broke, not all at once, not in a single, clean, cinematic moment of surrender. They broke the way great things break. Slowly at first, then all at once. One position abandoned, then another, then a third, and then the full weight of the accumulated retreat became irreversible, became a collapse, became a rout. Mount Othrys fell. The ancient stronghold of the Titan Age, that vast and venerable seat of primordial power, was taken by the storm, and the trident, and the darkness, and the 100 hands of liberated giants, and the Titans who had fought, Iapetus, Hyperion, Coeus, Creus, and the rest, were seized, bound with chains forged specifically for this purpose, chains that divine strength could not break, chains that were themselves a kind of cosmic argument about who held authority now. They were taken to Tartarus, the same abyss where Uranus had imprisoned the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires, the same lightless, fathomless prison. The symmetry was not lost on anyone who told the story afterward. The Hecatoncheires, those same 100-handed beings whose liberation had helped win the war, were set to guard the gates of Tartarus. Former prisoners, now wardens. The world had turned completely over, and Cronus himself. His fate was not identical to his brother's, though the accounts vary in their details with the particular freedom that mythology has always exercised around its most important figures. Some say he was cast into Tartarus with the others, into that ultimate darkness, to reign over nothing for eternity. Others, and there is something deeply, quietly beautiful about this version, say that Zeus eventually relented, that in the long aftermath of victory, in the slow settling of a cosmos, reorganized from its foundations, some mercy was extended even to the fallen king. In the more merciful telling, Cronus was sent instead to the Elysian fields, to the islands of the blessed, that paradise at the western edge of the world where the greatest and most favored souls were said to spend eternity. And there he ruled, in a strange and diminished and somehow fitting echo of the golden age he had once presided over. King of the blessed dead, sovereign of paradise, still a king, but a king of endings rather than of living things. The cosmos took a long breath. The Olympians took their thrones, and the world that you and I recognize, the world of Zeus's lightning and Poseidon's seas and Hades' quiet dominion over the dead, began. Every great story needs an ending, but the most honest endings are never truly endings at all. They are transformations. They are the moment when something that existed in one form quietly becomes something else, smaller perhaps, or different in shape, but persistent, still present, still exerting its gravity on everything around it, even from a great distance, even from a darkness that the living world can no longer see. Cronus did not simply end, he transformed, and what he left behind is larger than most fallen kings ever managed to leave. Let us begin with where he went, because the question of Cronus's ultimate fate is one of the most genuinely interesting disagreements in all of ancient mythology. A disagreement that tells us as much about the people asking the question as it does about the god himself. The darker tradition, favored by Hesiod and those who understood the cosmos as a place of strict and unforgiving consequence, places Cronus in Tartarus, chained in that bottomless dark alongside his brothers, sealed beneath the world he once ruled, with the 100-handed Hecatoncheires standing permanent watch at the gates. In this version there is a terrible, clean justice. The king who imprisoned his own children is himself imprisoned. The sovereign who sealed away those he feared is sealed away by the very forces his fear helped create. The symmetry is absolute and merciless, the way the symmetry of consequence so often is. But the other tradition breathes differently. It carries more air in it. In this version, held by Pindar, and carried forward through certain Orphic traditions that treated the mythology of the gods with a more mystical and forgiving eye, Zeus eventually freed his father. Not immediately, not easily, but eventually, in the long aftermath of victory, when the new order had settled and the cosmos had found its new rhythm, Zeus looked toward whatever prison held Cronus and made a choice that cost him something. He released him. And rather than destroying him or humiliating him further, he sent him west, to the islands of the blessed, to Elysium, to that luminous, gentle paradise at the far edge of the world, where the favored dead spent eternity in warmth and ease. And there, in a profound and poignant echo of everything he had once been, Cronus was made king again, king of the blessed dead, sovereign of paradise, ruler over those souls deemed most worthy of eternal peace. There is something almost unbearably fitting about that fate, the king of the golden age, that era of abundance and ease and effortless generosity that humanity would mourn for the rest of its existence, becomes the eternal guardian of the closest thing the afterlife has to a golden age. The wheel turns, and Cronus ends up somewhere not entirely unlike where he began, presiding over something beautiful, ruling something peaceful, stripped of the terror and the prophecy and the devouring, left with only the part of him that was always underneath everything else, a king who knew how to make the world feel like enough. Whether you find that merciful or melancholy depends, perhaps, on what you believe about the relationship between power and peace, about whether a king who ruled magnificently but consumed everything he loved deserves, in the end, a quiet garden at the edge of the world. The mythology does not answer that question. It simply holds both possibilities open, the way all great stories hold their deepest questions open, because the question itself is the point. Beyond his fate, consider his legacy. Because Cronus left fingerprints on the ancient world that extended far beyond Greece, the Romans absorbed him, as they absorbed so much of Greek divinity. And we named him Saturn. And Saturn became something extraordinarily important in Roman religious life, the presiding deity of Saturnalia, that beloved midwinter festival in which the normal order of Roman society was deliberately, joyfully inverted. Masters served their slaves, gifts were exchanged, courts were suspended, gambling, normally restricted, was permitted in the open. It was as if, once a year, Rome reached back through time toward the Golden Age and tried, briefly and imperfectly but genuinely, to feel what it had been like when the world was generous, without condition and hierarchy had not yet hardened into permanence. They were honoring Cronus, even under a different name, even centuries removed from the world that had first told his story. And there is more. The Greeks themselves connected Cronus through the irresistible similarity of sound, if not always of strict etymology, to Kronos, the god of time itself. This conflation was not always made by the ancient scholars, and the careful mythographers often distinguished between the two. But the popular imagination, which has always been wiser than the careful mythographers in certain ways, kept making the connection anyway. And it is not difficult to understand why, because Cronus is time. Not technically, not etymologically, but essentially. He is the force that devours what it produces. He is the king who consumes his own children. And what are children, in the deepest sense, but the future? What does time do, if not swallow the future as fast as it arrives, converting each new moment into past, the instant it appears? Cronus swallowed gods. Time swallows everything. The mechanism is different. The result is the same. The great painting by Francisco Goya, dark, visceral, unforgettable, titled Saturn, devouring his son, rendered in the 19th century on the walls of his own home, captures something of this. A wild-eyed giant consuming a human figure with a ferocity that is also, somehow, a kind of anguish. Goya understood that the image was not simply about a mythological event, it was about time, about age, about the terror of a world that produces and then reclaims endlessly without mercy or apology. Cronus lives there, in that painting, in Saturnalia, in the words Saturnine, which carries his Roman name as a descriptor for a particular kind of heavy, brooding, melancholic temperament, the mood of someone who feels the weight of time pressing down, who is aware of endings in the middle of things. He is in the scythe that later became the instrument of the personification of death, borrowed from that adamantine sickle that overthrew the sky. He is in every story about a parent who cannot release their child into the future, who holds on too tightly, who mistakes possession for protection. He is in the golden age itself, that ache we carry across every culture and every century for a time before complication, before toil, before the particular exhaustion of a world that requires so much of us simply to survive it. That longing is Cronus's longest shadow. The age he presided over was real, in the logic of the myth, and we have been reaching back toward it ever since it ended. That is what a fallen king leaves when the king was great enough. Not just a story, not just a cautionary tale about fear and power and the self-defeating nature of trying to swallow the future before it can threaten you, but a shape, an outline, a before and after that. Everything subsequent is measured against. The world we live in, with its hierarchies and its seasons and its mortality and its gods of thunder and sea and darkness, is the world that exists because Cronus lost, because a stone was swallowed in the place of a child, because Rhea made a choice in a cave in Crete, because the future, no matter how many times you swallow it, keeps coming back. Cronus held the cosmos in his hands and still could not hold on. And in the letting go, in that final, forced, inevitable release, everything we know came rushing in. Rest well, great king. The age you made was golden.